Hey, what's up guys? I asked if you wanted to see a Q&A video on the CO2 scrubber and you all said yes, so let's get into it. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is some of you have been asking how you can get involved. Now, the simplest thing I can say right now is make sure you watch these videos. Just watch them through. What happens is the more people that watch it and the longer you watch it for, the more the algorithm's going to promote the videos to other people and we can get more people on board. And then when we can actually start to roll out things that could either you guys can make or get involved with, there'll be a lot more people available, which will help out a lot. So make sure you like, subscribe, all that stuff, and check out the playlist and watch through all those videos if you can, because that's going to help out the most. Now, what I'm going to do is jump into some of the questions. Now, these questions I've pulled from either the community page, some of the questions on the videos from the playlist. I tried to grab as many of those similar questions as I could, so hopefully I didn't miss people that asked the same questions, but if I did, it was by accident only. Now, let's jump into the first question, which is, what algae will I be using? So, bit of a interesting question, because as I said when I first started this series was that I would probably use a few different types in each of the tubes. I'm still not 100% sure which way I'm going to go with this, but for example, as you can see with some of those questions, people will be asking about like spirulina and other already known algae samples of variations that actually absorb a lot more CO2 than others do. I'll talk about the spirulina a little bit more in the video, but as for some of those other known algae samples, one thing would be getting access to those samples, and then also having like the cultures being replicating them and keeping them alive, things like that. So there could be a few more things involved with the actual samples themselves. So I will keep on top of that to try and, I guess, answer that question a bit more into the next year with a lot of the videos as we start to actually grow the algae in the tubes. It shouldn't be too far off, but I believe at the end of the day I'll probably end up doing a few different types to just compare and also to test a few different things to see what results we get. But yeah, the answer's still not out on that one today. So next question I've seen come up a couple times around how much CO2 will be absorbed. Now, the answer to that one is there's too many variables to actually give a definitive answer. With all the variables, like in the last question about what type of algae, that's going to not only affect how much absorption there will be, but we're going to have a lot of things like the temperatures and the light levels, how long the light's exposed, the feedstocks that are going to be going into it may change that absorption rate. So we're talking things like the minerals and the actual breakdown of the water itself, which will change over time. And, you know, depending on what type of samples we're using, there may be trade-offs between, you know, the cost of keeping certain algae samples alive versus, you know, any downsides that they might have, or upsides being, you know, any leftover biomass that we can use or other bioproducts versus how much it's absorbing. So it's a tricky question to ask, because you really need to work out how much it's going to cost and also scale versus what we're going to get out of it. So all of this I'm planning on determining for each of those samples that I do create, which will mean that I'll probably need to create more than just those 4 tubes, and also the setup that they're in. I'll need to create a bunch of different variable setups, which I'm planning on doing in 2022. So how much algae can be absorbed in 1 liter of water type of question, bit hard to really answer that because there's not a set figure, because there's so many different things that can change. One of the questions around, it was kind of a little bit of a different question, but I thought I'd add it in because I wanted to speak on a part of this, is the idea about growing food and how much it absorbs CO2. Now, I can't really answer how much exactly food absorbs CO2 wise while it's growing, versus even some foods may emit more CO2 than they actually absorb. I'm not 100% sure. I can't answer that, but it'd be interesting to know. But one of the things I wanted to point out is things like the resources that they use, which kind of ties into how much CO2 would be absorbed in the algae. There's resources that get consumed while you're trying to do a lot of these things. So, even for example, food, you're using lots of water. You could be using, land size, which could be pulling out certain minerals out of the ground and the soil. So a lot of things like that. Whether or not there's waste that's then associated with the food as well, that's certain things you might, as it then decomposes, does it release CO2? There's a lot of different things there, but I think it would be an interesting thing to actually see and determine whether or not there is certain foods that absorb CO2. It's quite interesting. Now, one of the things that does pop up around, and I've talked about it earlier, with spirulina, and obviously that's something that can be taken as I have seen there's a process out there that a company was actually creating like chips with the spirulina, and which was pretty cool. But then in saying that, we're also talking then that it needs to be food grade, which that throws in a whole nother ballpark of your equipment that you're using. It needs to be all rated to that type of food quality standard, especially if you're in certain parts of the world where the food grade needs to be a lot higher than some other countries. So depending on what's actually being created, you would need to use the appropriate equipment, which then ties into how much effort it is to then create that. Is there a lot more expensive equipment that's being used? You would then need to look at how much trying to generate that food source, then shipping it to somewhere or whatever it might be, you're using packaging, things like that. There's so many different variables. So when it comes to food, it becomes quite a larger thing to look into. But valid question of what ways to try and utilize the CO2 in systems that can then be used for something else. So it's an interesting question. Now, I did get a question around the algae itself, and one of the things that popped up was around the algae being dead, or I was assuming that it was more the biomass that in that conversation. But what we really want to do is make sure that it's alive, because while it's alive, it's actually doing its photosynthesis work to create that biomass and actually absorb the CO2. So we don't want it to die. We want it to stay alive as long as possible. I'm not sure if anyone's seen Stowaway, the movie. There's a scene in there where they've actually growing algae in these containers, and obviously some of it's died, it's gone brown, which means it's no good, and needs to be disposed of. Which if it does die, and one of the things that becomes a little tricky when it comes to growing the algae is that if it does die, then how do we dispose of that properly? Because you can't just pour it down the sink or throw it in the garden or something like that. We've got there's obviously things within that we need to make sure we're disposing of it properly if it does die. So probably something that I'll need to look into too, because we can't just assume that the system's going to work 100% of the time, all the time. There may be times where there's not enough minerals that keep certain things alive. Maybe there's too much oxygen, not enough oxygen. Things like that can affect the algae, and also temperatures and things like that, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So we want to keep it alive, for as long as possible, and basically creating as much biomass as we can and extracting that, which leads to the next question around what to do with that biomass. What we want to do at the end of the day is capturing the CO2 into a form that we can then keep it captured. We don't want to capture it to then just let it go and go back out into the atmosphere again. We want to keep that CO2 captured. Then we want to work out what we can do with that byproduct or that biomass. Things that I'll be testing will obviously be things like, can we compress it? Can we dry it out? When we're drying it out, I'm going to need to test that within, say, a sealed chamber or a vacuum chamber or something like that, just to see what happens. Does it release CO2? Does it, how much does it hold? Is there a percentage? Does heat make it release more, or what? There's so many things that we can test. Once we know, okay, we can get that CO2 captured and stored in whatever form it is, then we look at ways to permanently or even semi-permanently for a long period of time actually store that, and that could be in many forms, whether or not it's, like, say for example, it's compressed into some form of a solid that can be used in another material or building process or something along those lines, which would be, quite useful, because then you can actually repurpose it for a product, or like, say for example, if putting it into concrete or bricks or something like that, and basically then we're creating a resource out of something that we want to pull out of the atmosphere, which is, I think it's not only good environment wise, but also, that product can then be utilized in other projects. If you could get it to be in a concrete, you're then removing the requirement for some other material, maybe something like that. So all things that we're going to definitely be looking into, because there's two if not three big parts of this project: is capture and storing it, and then also scaling. How do we make that go from a small little unit to a bigger scale, and at the cheapest, best, most efficient way? That's the way we got to do it. One of those other ways of actually storing and using that biomass is potentially looking into the biofuels side of things, which I can already see, a few applications in this space. Now, at the end of the day, when you're actually burning that biofuel, what's the downside to that? Is there more CO2 emissions from that? So you're capturing it, turning it into biofuel, which could be, the process to convert that could be, quite, lengthy and use up some resources, things like that. But then at the end of the day, to then re-emit that burnt fuel CO2 back into the atmosphere, a little bit counterproductive in some ways. But in saying that, if as a replacement of certain fossil fuels, which are constantly being mined or extracted from the earth, could be a positive type of shift across, which is, some ways still a positive, even though you still might be emitting some CO2 back in to the atmosphere. It might still be, at the end of the day, it's always going to be better than pulling it direct out of the earth again as a natural resource and using that up. So I think it's something we'll try as an experiment. It would be pretty, cool to see what results we get, and how hard it is, things like that. So we'll definitely be doing that some point in the future. So yeah, keep an eye out for that once we get through each of the stages. And yeah, so a few questions regarding the actual system itself that I'm currently using, this test system. We've got a couple questions here, and this one mainly around LED lighting to the tube and also reflective materials. I think part of this project will need to be working out the best way of supplying the correct amount of light versus the trade-off of how you generate that light or where you get that light from. So a big part of, say, for example, using sunlight only, you've obviously got a window there where the sun's out and actually hitting that part of the tubing or whatever it might be, that system. That only lasts for so long. But obviously it's a free resource that we're using, being the sun. When we look into LED lighting and having those type of lighting arrays around the tubes or underneath, I think there'll be a good combination of, what happens if we can get sunlight and also LED lighting as well, as like a, to pick up the rest of the day, or when the sun's down, or maybe when there's the cloud coverage or something like that. And also a whole nother section of just LED only tubes, which I think will be interesting to see what the difference will be. Like I said earlier on, how much absorption rate there will be. Does it also cut out some issues where we have things like evaporation of water, also things like heat on the tubes itself. We don't want to be boiling the water to a point where it gets too hot, kills off the algae. So good few different things we can test and try. I've already got ideas in my head of how I'm going to do this, so I'm looking forward to putting them in place and trying them out. So we'll go through those as we go through into next year and such. Which also, good question here about cooling and shading for the system, which, around having an automatic shade system or a cooling system, like a radiator, if it gets too hot. This is actually a really good question, because as algae gets gets to a certain temperature, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head what it is, but as it gets too high, the algae starts to die off. So we want to keep the temperatures at the right amount, and whether or not there's a perfect spot for the temperature versus the fluctuation of day and night, we need to work that out as well. And also work out, well, is it more efficient, or do we get better results if we have some type of artificial heating and cooling to keep that water temperature at the perfect range, keeping in mind that anything we use that's artificial potentially will have some type of downside, like it may use electricity or something like that to actually regulate that temperature. Because especially in the sun, direct sunlight on the tubes may heat it up too much. So, a shading system may be quite suitable, or even just to let through certain percentage of light, things like that. Does it make the system less efficient? We'll find out. But those temperature sensors that are installed in the tubes, perfect way to find out exactly what the temperature is, and we can regulate from those sensors. So it's a good thing those were installed inside. Now, in regards to sensors, a couple questions around using a spectrophotometer, hopefully I've said that right, and a turbidity sensor. These both come in pretty similar type of categories. It's actually checking, there's something, a sensor that's checking inside that water, making sure how much density or how cloudy the water is, things like that, giving us an indication of potentially how that biomass is growing and that algae growth inside the tubes. Future system, yes, I think will be very handy. In the current tube setup, I don't know if I'll have enough room, and also cutting or modifying the tubes to maybe install some of these sensors or get it right may be a bit much for the moment. I think as a start off with the testing and stuff, probably won't put these in, but I think we'll be definitely in future systems we'll need to have something like this, especially when you come to the point of automation, and having less involvement of actually taking samples, testing it, seeing, okay, here's where we're at with the water and things like that. We want to try and automate as much, put as much sensors in as possible. That's going to be the best way to do it. When it comes to the water in the tubes, there was a question around using distilled water versus tap water because of the chlorine and other particles inside the water. Now, I believe another viewer actually put a response there, which is kind of in the lines of thinking as well. Distilled water obviously has everything taken out of it, all the minerals, all the chlorine, everything. So it's just water, which is good in a way. We know there's no particles, it's just clear. Problem is that obviously the algae needs to have those minerals and such in it to survive and grow. Without it, it's not going to last very long. But at the same time, if you were to use drinking water, it would also kill off the algae, because it's actually, the chlorine's going to kill it. The chlorine that's placed in water is designed to help with a lot of those things as well, in the actual pipes and all that stuff. So we can use the drinking water and actually aerate the water and bubble that chlorine out. It'll actually disappear over a little bit of time. So we can do that and still keep the minerals that come in it already. I think it'll be a good test to kind of do both ways, to be honest. I think using the distilled water will get it to basically, it's just clear. We then have the added minerals that we record and measure out exact amount of minerals to find the best setup and combo. Because if we were doing just basic, let's say tap water, we get the chlorine out of it, we put it in the tubes, we still don't know where the minerals started. So whenever we add more minerals, we can test, I guess. But I think to try and work out a perfect good starting point, I think it would be good to try distilled water. But then at the same time, we want to try and avoid costs, and it may be a lot easier to get, let's say, from when we talk about scalability, if you were to run this system at a level where there was, let's say, 10,000 litres, 10,000 litres of tap water is going to be a lot easier to get than 10,000 litres of distilled water, and probably a bit cheaper too. So, trade-offs. Like there's a lot of, like most things I've talked about, there's a lot of different trade-offs. So we can try them both and we'll see how we go. So next question's around the power to the system and, how the system's actually getting fed electricity. Obviously, with all the sensors and equipment and the air pumps, all that stuff needs electricity. We can't get around that. But what we can get around is where we're getting that electricity from. When we look at, can we use solar, batteries, things like that? Yes, we can. Am I planning to do that? Yes, I am. I've mentioned it a few times now. For the moment, we're just going to plug it in to get it going. It's, at the end of the day, can be used, electricity off the grid can be used as a backup, but primarily run it from the solar and battery setup. Now, what needs to be worked out? Same thing if we're going to scale it, or even as a basic system. Now, what's it going to take to actually install the solar and battery system versus what using from the grid? That's all costs and things that need to be taken into account. Not so much on a smaller scale like we got now, but on a bigger scale, definitely. As for solar and battery stuff now, you've probably noticed on my channel I've been doing a lot of videos around batteries and 18650 cells, testing, charging, all that stuff as we go through. And I'm going to be doing more videos on batteries and solar, how to set things up, create your own little mini grid system at home, things like that. Everything's going to be more DIY based, so it's going to be helpful for this system when I can shift it across to doing solar, which then, we're not so worried like in this other question about transformer loss and efficiencies, because obviously any transformer where you're transforming the voltage from one voltage to another, there's always going to be losses. You're always going to lose something. So it's not, it's more the efficiency of that transformer that's going to help you. But if we have the system that's running, solar output might be 12 volts, we can run some of that almost direct into the pumps or things like that, instead of having that 240 volt conversion. So yeah, all things that'll be done in the future. Now, in regards to building a small home system, I like the idea. I think, I want to be able to get it set up for this type of system that can be set up at home for anyone, whether or not that's at a really small scale or a bigger scale. I think a lot of it does come down to the abilities of the people that are actually setting it up. Kind of like any real system or kit that you're setting up at home, everyone's going to have different skill levels, understandings, things like that. Ideally, a kit that could be set up would be pretty cool at whatever scale. And then obviously to have everything built into it electronics wise that could determine this is exactly what's going on inside this system, and be able to tell you, yep, it needs more water, it needs more minerals and these exact ones, or some type of system like that would be pretty cool. So I'm hoping to have some type of system idea like that would be cool in future. Probably not on the cards to design it right at the moment. I think, like Kanuki says there about smells and things like that, that is one thing that will need to be kind of worked through and tested. Is there anything that's outputting from the system that could be, not the best inside a house? That's another question, because you don't want to be setting something up that's going to create issues for your health or breathing, things like that, especially when there's we're talking about things that you could potentially be breathing in. So yeah, there's a bit of work in that one, but I think down the track could be something that'd be worthwhile looking into, and even having kits on bigger scales as well would be pretty cool. In saying that, kind of leads me to the question around the parts list. I get a few questions, every now and again, someone saying, where can I get this from? The parts itself that I'm using right now, a lot of the stuff, I guess a majority of the parts I have explaining, I'm doing a video on that sensor or, whatever it might be. These parts that I'm using now are highly based around this being a test system. I wouldn't recommend that people go out there, you can if you want, but I wouldn't recommend that you try and build this test system as your final product. This is like the test phase. Is the system going to work? What's going to, what type of outputs we're going to get, things like that. The end design and what the final product could look like in the last question about, home systems, could be completely different to this. We probably wouldn't need to have certain sensors or certain components that we do in this system. So I kind of not really wanting to put together a components list in a sense, because it's kind of just that test system. If you're building it, you really probably want to understand exactly what's going on and be kind of doing this whole thing from scratch, kind of like I have been. So it's really, I really wouldn't be getting to the point of buying all these products if you're not quite sure exactly what you're going to build. Kind of gets into this next question around the design and the final design. The scaling of the design is one question, and finalizing this design at the moment, this test phase, I think, is finalized, you know, with this tubing setup with the 4 tubes. Now, how is that then scaled to a bigger size? I got multiple ideas to go down, like different paths. But yeah, there's probably a test phase at the moment, and then I've got a bit of a scalability test phase to make sure that that would work. And then from there, it's kind of like, here's the final product. So there's a lot of design that kind of comes into that. It's probably one of those things that, like I said before in the parts list question, you know, until I know what that final design is, I can't really answer how that's going to come along, because, you know, obviously things might change with, you know, when we test it and find, well, actually the tubes need to be a lot bigger because of XYZ, or, you know, we need to have higher airflow or less airflow, ways to stop the temperature from changing too dramatically, you know, so many different things. So I think for the moment, this test phase design is finalized, but we've got a whole new bunch of things when it comes to the scalability of the project and, you know, what we're going to do in the end design. Unfortunately, I know that a large portion of these questions are basically saying, not sure. And that's because, you know, all of this is just trying to work out how this works, how we can get it to work the best way, and yeah, trying to make sense of it myself at the same time. So hopefully you guys stick with me, watch the videos, keep up to date, make sure you're subscribed, all that stuff. We can keep going through it. I'm happy to answer questions as we go through, and even, you know, suggestions, things like that. I'd love to read a lot of your comments as well, so keep sending them through. Let me know if you want me to do more type of Q&As and stuff like that. I'm happy to, you know, do them more regularly if people want to, you know, get certain questions answered, things like that. Just let me know, and we'll go from there. So hopefully this has answered a few questions for you. Yeah, let me know if you have any more questions in the comments below. But that's about it for this video. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.